The year is 1978. The location is Speedway, Indiana, a town defined by its obsession with racing and its quiet suburban rhythm. It's a place where people leave their doors unlocked, where teenagers work late shifts without fear, and where the most exciting thing that usually happens is the Indianapolis 500. But on the night of Friday, November 17th, that sense of safety was permanently dismantled. This is not a story about monsters or supernatural entities. This is a story about the mundane horror of human violence, the fragility of routine, and one of the most mishandled crime scenes in American history. It is a case that remains unsolved, leaving a scar on the Midwest that has never fully healed. This is the story of the Burger Chef murders. To understand the weight of this event, you have to understand the setting. In the late 1970s, Burger Chef was a massive fast food chain, a direct competitor to McDonald's. The location in Speedway was a popular hangout. It was a Friday night, the start of the weekend. The restaurant had been busy, filled with the noise of teenagers and families. By 11 p.m., the rush had ended. The dining room was empty. The lights were dimmed. Inside, 4 young employees were preparing to close the store. There was the assistant manager, 20-year-old Jane Freet. She was responsible, hardworking, and looked up to by the younger crew. Then there was 17-year-old Ruth Ellen Shelton and 2 16-year-olds, Daniel Davis and Mark Flemons. These were good kids. They weren't involved in gangs. They weren't drug dealers. They were high school students and young adults working for minimum wage to buy cars or save for college. The closing routine was standard. Wipe down the tables, sweep the floors, count the drawer, take out the trash. It was a process they had done dozens of times before. Sometime between 11 p.m. and midnight, something went wrong. The first sign that the routine had been broken came shortly after midnight. Another employee, a young man who was off duty, drove by the restaurant to pick up the 4 workers. They had plans to go hang out after the shift. When he pulled into the parking lot, he noticed something strange. The lights were still on, but the restaurant looked deserted. He walked up to the back door. It wasn't just unlocked, it was standing wide open, swinging slightly in the cold November wind. He stepped inside. The restaurant was silent. The fryers were off. The grill was cold. But the signs of life were still there, frozen in time. Ruth Ellen Shelton's purse was still on a shelf in the office. Jane Freet's jacket was still there, despite the freezing temperatures outside. The cash register drawers were sitting open and empty on the counter. The safe was open. But perhaps the most unsettling detail was the personal items left behind. Cigarettes, lighters, keys. Things you do not leave behind if you are leaving voluntarily. The friend called the police. When the Speedway Police Department arrived, they made an assessment that would doom the investigation for decades to come. Looking at the empty safe and the missing employees, they didn't see a kidnapping or a mass murder. They saw petty theft. The police theorized that the 4 kids had taken the night's deposit, roughly $580, and gone out to party. They assumed the employees had staged a robbery to steal a relatively small amount of money and go ride-riding. This assumption wasn't just an opinion, it dictated their procedure. Because they believed it was a case of employee embezzlement, they did not seal off the restaurant. They did not dust for fingerprints on the back door. They did not photograph the positions of the items left behind. Instead, the next morning, the police allowed the day shift employees to come in and open the store for business. Imagine that scene. Saturday morning, the morning crew arrives. They are told the night crew stole some money and ran off. So they do what they are paid to do. They clean. They scrub the floors with bleach. They wipe down the counters. They wash the dishes. In doing so, they unknowingly washed away every fingerprint, every fiber, every footprint, and every piece of forensic evidence the perpetrators had left behind. The crime scene was sanitized by the very company that had been victimized. By Saturday afternoon, the parents of the missing 4 were frantic. These were not kids who ran away. Mark Flemons was a quiet, church-going boy. Daniel Davis was known for being reliable. Jane and Ruth were responsible young women. They wouldn't vanish for $500. As the hours turned into a full day, the partying theory began to crumble. The kids hadn't come home. They hadn't called. On Sunday morning, November 19th, the reality of the situation shifted from a missing persons case to a nightmare. Hikers were walking through a remote wooded area in Johnson County, about 20 miles south of the Speedway restaurant. It was a rugged, isolated patch of land, far from the main roads. There, among the dead leaves in the trees, they found the 4 employees. The scene in the woods was chaotic and brutal, suggesting a terrifying end to the night. The victims were still wearing their brown and orange polyester Burger Chef uniforms. Ruth Ellen Shelton and Daniel Davis were found lying side by side, face down. They had been executed. Both had been shot in the back of the head and neck with a .38 caliber firearm. It appeared they had complied with their captors, perhaps hoping that cooperation would save them, only to be killed where they lay. Jane Freet, the assistant manager, was found a short distance away. Her death was different. She had been stabbed twice in the chest. The force of the blow was so violent that the blade of the hunting knife had broken off and remained lodged in her chest. The handle of the knife was missing. Mark Flemons was found the furthest away. His death was the most confusing to the coroner. He hadn't been shot, and he hadn't been stabbed. He had suffered massive blunt force trauma to the head and face, and he had ultimately died from asphyxiation on his own blood. The reconstruction of the scene suggests a moment of pure panic. Investigators believe that when the shooting started, Mark and Jane tried to run. The darkness of the woods would have been absolute. Mark, in a desperate sprint for his life, likely ran full speed into a tree or was bludgeoned with a heavy object like a chain or a flashlight as he tried to escape. He fell, unconscious or unable to move, and died alone in the dark. The police were now dealing with a quadruple homicide. The trivial amount of money missing, less than $600, made the brutality of the crime even more difficult to comprehend. 4 young lives had been extinguished for what amounted to pocket change per victim. With the restaurant crime scene destroyed by the cleaning crew, investigators had very little to go on. They had to rely on eyewitness accounts from the night of the disappearance. This is where the timeline begins to form and where the phantom of the killer begins to take shape. Witnesses reported seeing a suspicious car in the Burger Chef parking lot that night. A muscle car, possibly a Chevrolet Vega or a Camaro. More importantly, 2 separate witnesses gave descriptions of 2 men they saw at the restaurant shortly before closing. One man was described as the bearded man. He was white, with a scruffy beard, not well groomed. The police produced a composite sketch that became famous in Indiana, but despite the sketch being circulated everywhere, no one could identify him. Another witness, a 16-year-old boy who had been at the restaurant earlier, provided a detail that still chills investigators. He said he saw 2 men loitering near the back of the lot. He described one of them as having a fair peach fuzz complexion. This witness was actually scheduled to work that night, but he had traded shifts with Mark Flemons. That trade saved his life and cost Mark his. The investigation dragged on. The Johnson County Sheriff's Department and the Indiana State Police tried to piece together the movement of the victims. They found Jane Freet's car, a Chevrolet Vega, abandoned in town not far from the police station. The driver's side door was unlocked. This suggested the abduction started in the parking lot. The victims were loaded into a vehicle, possibly Jane's car and the killer's car, and driven the 20 miles to the woods. Think about that drive. 20 miles. That is roughly 30 minutes of driving. 4 teenagers, likely held at gunpoint, crammed into a car driving through the dark Indiana countryside. The fear in that vehicle is unimaginable. They must have known as the lights of the town faded and the road turned to gravel and dirt that they were not going to be released. Months turned into years. The Speedway mystery became a cold case, but there were leads. There were always leads. One of the most compelling theories involved a group of men from a nearby town who were known for robbing fast food restaurants. The modus operandi fit. They were violent, They targeted the closing shift, and they knew the layouts. However, without physical evidence, remember the restaurant had been cleaned, prosecutors could never build a solid case. Then, 6 years later, in 1984, a break seemed to appear. A man named Donald Forrester, who was already in prison for rape, called investigators. He wanted to make a deal. He claimed he knew who killed the Burger Chef 4. Forrester was a career criminal. He was manipulative and dangerous. He told police that he had been involved in the crime to collect a debt owed by the brother of one of the victims. This was a new angle, a targeted hit, rather than a robbery. He led police to the woods. He knew exactly where the bodies had been found. He knew about the broken knife handle, a detail that had not been widely publicized. He even led them to a stream where he claimed they had thrown the gun. Police searched the water and found .38 caliber shell case. It seemed like the end. Forrester confessed to shooting 2 of the victims. He claimed his associates killed the others. He described the panic when Mark Flemons tried to run. It fit the evidence. But then the confession fell apart. Forrester was known to be a liar who sought attention and better prison conditions. When it came time to formally charge him, he panicked and recanted his confession. He claimed he had been coerced. Then he claimed he made it up. The police were stuck. They had a confession, they had knowledge of the crime scene, but they also had a witness with zero credibility. Donald Forrester died in prison in 2006, taking whatever truth he held to his grave. Was he the killer? Or was he just a man who had heard the details from the real killers in the prison yard? We don't know. The tragedy of the Burger Chef murders is not just in the violence, but in the institutional failure. If the police had sealed the scene that night, if they hadn't assumed the kids were thieves, we might have had fingerprints, we might have had footprints, we might have had justice. Instead, we are left with a lingering unease. The building where the Burger Chef stood is now a different business, but the memory remains. The parents of the victims spent the rest of their lives waiting for a phone call that never came. This case changed the way fast food restaurants operate in America. Before 1978, it was common for 1 or 2 kids to close a store alone and walk out the back door with a bag of cash. After this, the buddy system became mandatory. Back doors were alarmed. Trash runs were done before dark. The innocence of the teenage summer job died in those woods in Johnson County. Today, the killer or killers could still be alive. They would be in their 60s or 70s now. They might be grandfathers, living quiet lives in the suburbs of Indianapolis, driving past the site of the old restaurant, carrying a secret that 4 families would give anything to uncover. The Burger Chef murders remain Indiana's most infamous cold case. It serves as a grim reminder that safety is an illusion, that a routine Friday night can turn into a nightmare in seconds, and that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are just men who walk away into the darkness, never to be seen again. The woods in Johnson County are quiet now. The trees have grown over the spot where the bodies were found. But for those who remember November 1978, the silence is deafening. The back door is still swinging open in their minds, and the question remains, who ordered the 4 employees into the car, and why did they have to die for $581? That is the Speedway mystery, and until someone speaks, the case remains open, cold, and waiting.